Thank you all for coming to this event. This is a really exciting one for me because it's certainly an area where I have been learning a lot, but have so much more to learn in terms of exploring the impact possibilities of Web3. And I'm delighted to be joined by a real expert to explore that, Mark Pascall. Before I go any further though, I don't think I've even introduced myself. My name's Tom. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Start Some Good and the host of the Start Some Good network and our event series. And I want to acknowledge that I'm joining you from the traditional lands of the Camaragal people of the Eora Nation here on the North Shore of Sydney. And I want to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging here and acknowledge that this land, like the rest of Australia, was never ceded. And I also want to acknowledge, the diversity of stories and traditions and cultures represented by each of you and the lands upon which you're joining us as well. And if you would like to, please share where you're tuning in from and the traditional owners of that land, if you know it. In the chat. It's always great to know where people are tuning in from. So as I said, today's
just a sec. Actually, can I call you back? I'm just on a webinar.
I'm going to mute Jenny while she deals with her phone call. Yes, today's event is one of an ongoing series that we host as part of the Start Some Good network, which is a learning community for early stage and aspiring social entrepreneurs and founders. I can acknowledge my co-hosts of the network, Cameron Price and Nimity, are also with us today. And through these events, we explore, emerging topics of interest in terms of social change and new frontiers of social change, specific skills and insights people need to make change and to lead change. And often the kind of motivations, life stories, and learnings of more experienced founders and leaders who are out there. And today we'll do a little bit of all of that, but with an obvious focus on exploring the topic of Web3 for social impact. This has been obviously something that has kind of blown up in terms of awareness and attention over the last just couple of years. Many of us, very few of us could consider ourselves experts. Many of us often feel bewildered by the different acronyms and phrases and concepts that get thrown around, the difference between Web3 and blockchain, what's a DAO. So we're going to cover some of that 101 today, but trying to move through into a bit of a 102, thinking about kind of, what all of this really means or could mean for our society and impact. And so to explore those topics, I'm delighted to be joined by Mark Pascall, the founder of the Wellbeing Protocol. Mark is passionate about all things decentralized and blockchain for public good. He's the founder of the Wellbeing Protocol, a microeconomic system to support community well-being, and the DAO.agency, a DAO or Decentralized Autonomous Organisation based out of New Zealand, providing a range of services in the blockchain, decentralized governments and DAO space. And one of the founding members of the Metacartel Venture DAO, which is a $50 million Venture Capital DAO fund. He's also run the first university course in the world on DAOs in New Zealand, co-founder BlockchainLabs, and a whole bunch of other things, Executive Director of Blockchain New Zealand, featured in the Decentralized Thriving book, and a bunch else. One of the best people we could possibly have this conversation with about Web3 and social impact. And I also want to acknowledge we're also being joined by Alex Hannant from the Eunice Centre at Griffith University, who helped, who helped set us up for this conversation. Thank you, Alex, and he'll be contributing and helping steer the conversation and providing some thoughts as appropriate as we go, because the Eunice Centre has been doing a lot of work on some of these kind of new frontiers in funding and organisation for mission-led organisations and ecosystems. So thank you, Mark and Alex, for joining us today.
Thank
you. So really excited, so many threads to pull on. It's almost hard to know where to start, Mark, but why don't we start by just what brought, you're obviously deep in the Web3 for impact space now. What pulled you into that pool?
Yes, it's been an interesting journey. I've spent, so I'm from the UK originally, but lived my second half of my life out in New Zealand, Wellington, where I live. My career has predominantly been in the world of software development. Started out as a developer and then ended up running a software development company for many years. But part of my role within that company was to look at new and emerging technologies. And this led me down a couple of key rabbit holes. One was the blockchain space. About 8 years ago, I went to a conference in Queenstown called Bitcoin South. and really knowing nothing about the space. And by day 3, the penny dropped for me, and sort of came this realization that this was much more than a new technology or a new currency. This really had the potential to change the way society operates. So got back to Wellington, and we ended up sort of transitioning our sort of Web 2 company into a Web 3 company, and end up focusing on security, smart contract auditing, and that sort of stuff. But the other sort of rabbit hole I was going down at a similar sort of time was looking into sort of alternative management and governance systems. So these things like sociocracy, holacracy, teal, that sort of patterns that sort of challenge many of the default ways that we structure and govern our organizations. So non-hierarchical, self-managing, evolutionary purpose, all that stuff. So I became super interested in that as well, just completely independently of the blockchain stuff. And then I guess also this overarching sort of life focus that I've had around human well-being. I actually got quite sick in my 20s with chronic fatigue syndrome for about 10 years, and this led me down this sort of path of learning around sort of more holistic well-being. And so really, this all came together a few years ago. Had the opportunity to step away from my sort of services business and refocus on projects that could combine all these areas of interest. So essentially, since then, I've been sort of focusing on essentially well-being and social impact DAOs, and we can talk about a bit what a DAO is in a minute. But yeah, and a key part of that has been this project, the Wellbeing Protocol.
So we probably should define a few key terms, I suppose, that are likely to continue to get sprinkled through the conversation and cause confusion if we don't establish them. Could you just kind of, while we are moving, aiming our sights on the 102 conversation, let's just deal with a little bit of the Web3 101 stuff. Could you define a few key terms for us? What do you mean by Web3? Is that different, or is it just a new phrase for blockchain? And then let's define DAOs as well.
Yeah, the Web3 is kind of being used now interchangeably with blockchain. I think it's just a bit trendier and a bit slightly wider, because in theory Web3 could encompass some other things, but for all intents and purposes, think of it as similar to blockchain. And really sort of, I've talked about DAOs a few times, but I think it's worth just discussing the sort of the infrastructure that allows DAOs to exist, which is essentially the blockchain. So the interesting bit is, so second generation, well, I call them second generation blockchains. I consider sort of Bitcoin as kind of first generation blockchains. Second generation blockchains like Ethereum give us essentially this global infrastructure that allows us to execute code and transfer value. But this infrastructure is got a couple of unique properties. One, it's not controlled by any single person or entity, so there's no big corporation or no government who can call the shots. And number two, we in theory can trust that the code that is plonked on this thing will run as it says on the box. So this is the idea of a smart contract, a self-executing bit of code that once it's put on, then nobody, even the person who put it on, can stop it. And so that's what a smart contract is. So we now have this truly global, in theory, immutable, unstoppable system for building so-called trustless software applications. But quite early on, what people also realized is that you can also build actual organizations using this infrastructure. And in fact, it kind of blurs the line between what is an organization or a company or a community or an economy. I guess I sort of describe it sort of slightly more holistically as sort of any entity that allows a group of value-aligned people to come together to achieve a common purpose. So whether you call that a company or a community, an economy or whatever, that becomes semantic. And I guess I became really interested in, perhaps we can use some of the awesome learnings and research from the teal, sociocracy, holacracy world and actually start to design these organizations on the blockchain in a better way, perhaps better suited for the current challenges that we're facing within the current system. So hypercapitalism, power centralization, the problem of dividing the world into 200 self-governing bits and all the sort of problems with that. So the sort of definition of a DAO that I quite like, a DAO is a borderless, open, transparent organization that aims to most efficiently achieve a set of purpose-driven goals through the use of independent agents driven by incentive mechanisms. So, and there's many different definitions of DAOs, but essentially I quite like that one. But in order to sort of have a DAO, you need effective governance, treasury management, reputation, and value transfer systems. You need quite a lot of plumbing work sort of in place to allow that to happen, and that doesn't really happen out of the box with a blockchain. You have to sort of write code, you have to build those components to do that, and that's what is being built and is being experimented with over the last sort of few years in this sort of Web3 ecosystem. And this is kind of the world of tokenomics, and you have to sort of decide, the community has to decide on things like, do you want a plutocratic voting system, i.e. that favors people with more sort of power, more money, or do you want a reputation-based voting system? How do you want to admit people in? How do you want to chuck people out? The legal regulatory challenges of, how on earth you fit inside a legal regulatory system that has been designed fundamentally to control centralized entities, i.e. entities with a person at the top that you can put in jail, as opposed to a decentralized entity which has no single sort of point of control. So that's a challenge. So hopefully that gives you a bit of an overview. So we've got this infrastructure. That's kind of we've got this sort of three layers. We've got the internet infrastructure, then we've got the blockchain sort of infrastructure, and now we've got the sort of DAO plumbing infrastructure that we can sort of use components and create a DAO, which is this organization that lives on the blockchain.
So what's the big, I guess, obviously we go through, eras of different technology, and in terms of, particularly what's kind of the plumbing of what's going on in the internet, what's establishing the protocols, managing protocols around interaction and so on. What do you think is the big cultural shift from Web 2 to Web 3? Because obviously when we use these big phrases like Web 1, Web 2, Web 2, we're saying it's more than just, while there might be a technology element, the shift from Web 1 to Web 2 wasn't really about a new tech. Obviously, it was an emerging area of tech around human interaction, and the move from kind of, content being controlled centrally to a focus on infrastructure that enabled all of us to create content to share with each other, the world of social technology. And that was, that was a set of technologies, but no one defining technology. Whereas this is kind of one core technology. And I'm just wondering what you think. What is the kind of the big picture cultural change in the way we're all going to be using the internet or interacting with each other that is represented by that Web 2 to Web 3 evolution?
Yes. So I would argue the shift from Web 2 to Web 3 is much more fundamental. So Web 1 is essentially just publishing information, just, instead of putting a newspaper out on a bit of paper, you put it on a website and everybody can see it. Web 2 was more interaction, was online banking, was Uber, was Facebook, was all that stuff. But what happened with Web 2, and there was this excitement around sort of how it was going to sort of improve the world and sort of democratize lots of things. But what happened is it just sort of gave this sort of mechanism for almost capitalism to sort of go into overdrive and for sort of centralization and disintermediation to occur at a global scale. So the organization has got bigger and bigger, and we now have these mega corporations, Facebook, Google, etc., who have way too much power because they've been allowed to are able to centralize in a global way. So the sort of the shift from Web 2 to Web 3 is much more fundamental, because we can now, and we simply couldn't do that before, we can now build systems that are community driven. These are sort of open source, transparent protocols that define rules that we can all, in theory, see those rules. We can all, in fact, this is the sort of the more positive view. There's probably the more sort of utopian view that there's obviously there are other views, but yeah, we can, in theory, we can create systems that are controlled by everybody, and things are more transparent, and we can have better governance systems than our sort of the systems we tend to have in place within our sort of democratic systems, which are very coarse and sort of rooted in hundreds of years patterns. So we can sort of create these new systems that are truly global. And I think, my opinion is that we have to have those systems to solve some of the big climate change problems, because they're not going to get solved when you've got 200 countries all looking after their own people. So yeah.
So cool. Well, that's I'm interested in that, and this is where I think it is so important to distinguish between blockchain Web3 from crypto and currency mechanisms, because it feels like at the moment on that side of things there is a certain centralization instinct, much as it allows for a lot of open source and a lot of decentralization, that there's a few key that in order to make it easy for the average person to engage, in the same way that I guess the technology exists for us to whip up our own Twitter clone, but you want to be where everyone else is. And so do you think that, before we get to the big opportunity, I guess, do you have, just to see maybe some of the risks, do you think there is despite the kind of opening up, democratizing promise of the technology, fundamentally, are there also, it also exists in an economic system that does have venture funded players, that is a race to win market share in terms of bringing new people into the Web3 world? And do you think there are risks that some of those there will be key centralized bottlenecks in terms of where people can transact, where people can set up wallets, and so on, and so that even though in theory we can all own it for ourselves, that something similar could occur, if we're not careful, that occurred with social media, where people end up kind of following the crowd a little bit, going where it is easier, and it ends up kind of centralizing through a few key companies, which wasn't necessarily inherent in the technology, but inherent in the sociology of how we want to interact with each other online.
Yeah, and I think that is definitely a risk, and why I'm so passionate around sort of mobilizing as many people as we can to sort of create an opposing force to that. I would say that that because these systems can be made to be fully transparent, the hope is there are more good people than bad people in the world, and if these centralized systems do start to emerge, people will vote with their feet and move more towards the sort of community controlled systems and the systems that have more transparency. And so there's, but you're right that there's absolutely a risk that's and this is playing out a little bit in the sort of early crypto market. We're seeing the big venture capitalists sort of dominating and having increased voting power because they got in early and they've got more token ownership. But we are also seeing this a sort of democratization, and some of the big DAOs like Uniswap, they have huge, they control billions of dollars of wealth, all in a sort of open, transparent system, and anybody can join, whether you're a sort of anybody in the world can join and partake in these systems.
Cool. So I think that's why it is so important that I guess we all are empowered to understand how to use the tools, so to speak, in the pursuit of our own goals and missions, not just to interact, I guess, with with prepackaged platforms and opportunities and so on. So could you kind of to get us all excited around what are the opportunities? What do you see as the big opportunity here? You mentioned climate change. Maybe you could sketch out a little bit more how you think this new technology or new era could help us tackle that, and just how would you to a group of the less initiated, define what is the big opportunity here? Why should we all be making the effort to learn and understand and get involved?
I guess the way I see it is, on the big elephant in the room, climate change, is that people know it's a problem. People want to make a difference, and they're avoiding using their plastic bags, etc. But at the end of the day, we're still seeing the effects of governments who want to be re-elected in the next term, and there's still this pressure to look after the economic wealth of their own people versus within the next 3 or 4 years within the election cycle period versus the state of the earth in 10, 15, 40 years. So it's a problem with the sort of the election cycle time frame and the fact that we're divided up into 200 bits. And so I see that as a sort of really systemic major problem, and until we can come up with an alternative system, and I see the potential for a DAO to emerge, which is save the planet DAO, whatever it sort of and there are lots of DAOs being sort of built along those lines. But if that entity became was anybody can join in the world, anybody could donate to, and the incentive mechanism was incentive mechanisms were right, this DAO could potentially become as powerful as the American government or Amazon or whoever, and start to sort of have global influence on this problem by pooling resources, allocating resources, putting pressure, funding projects that matter. But yeah, just being a truly global entity that isn't under the control of any corporation or government. I feel as though that's got to be the way out of this challenge that we're facing.
So what's your theory of how we build to that point? I'm always interested. Kind of my starting point as a kind of social entrepreneur and activist was doing a lot of work kind of engaging young people as active citizens in democracy in Australia, and caring a lot about, I still care enormously about the overall quality of our democracy and people's engagement. And so, of course, over, the 25 years that I've been engaged in these sorts of things and meeting people, you come across a lot of interesting ideas for different ways to do democracy, putting aside the specific tech, just different, direct democracy mechanisms, more proportional, more engaged. And obviously technology makes a lot of those more realistic on an operational point of view. But what I began to feel like over this time is that often there's kind of like a little bit of a, it's a little bit like the elves business model in South Park. There's, what do we, this thing, and then on the other side there's functioning democracy, but kind of how you get from individual test cases or just the technological potential to then obviously completely rewire a governance system is very tricky to do. And I'd be interested in how you think this can kind of, what do you see as kind of the possible path of spread that starts with the kind of experiments that we have now from where we are now and ends with, a completely new form of global governance? What are some of the in-between stages?
Yeah, well, I think sort of trying to change our existing system of government is simply going to be too slow and too painful. Isn't going to happen. There's too much power and too much sort of vested interest to sort of change that quickly enough. So I see the effort and the focus being on experimenting with these alternative systems. And there's some really interesting, sort of crypto primitives, tokenomic primitives like conviction voting and quadratic funding and sort of things that are being experimented with to sort of capture opinion from communities and allocate resources effectively, which are really interesting, and a whole bunch more of those are being all sorts of things like that. And so they're being experimented with, and there'll be a whole lot of failures. There'll be a whole lot of things that sort of don't go to plan or have adverse side effects that we didn't account for. But I think out of that hopefully will emerge some really powerful patterns that will simply because of they've got it right, they will just grow organically and keep on going because they've got the incentive mechanisms right. They are a better way to govern a group, and they just go gangbusters and grow. So but there'll be how that sort of coexists with our current hierarchical system of government is I don't know how that's going to sort of coexist, but it will. It
starts with experiments, it starts with trying stuff. I think that's exactly right. So let's get a bit deeper into the experiments, the work that you're doing. Tell us about what is the Wellbeing Protocol in a nutshell?
Yeah, I guess in a nutshell, before I talk about that, I'll just talk about the sort of the problem we're trying to solve. So essentially the problem we're trying to solve is disempowered communities. So there's a really interesting book came across a while ago called The Third Pillar by Raghuram Rajan. So he was the former IMF chief economist and head of India's central bank. And the way he described it in his book is that society is supported by three pillars. We've got the sort of the free market, capitalist sort of corporation pillar. We've got the state government pillar, and then we've got the community pillar. And a few hundred years ago, they were kind of in reasonable alignment. Then we had the sort of agricultural, technological, industrial revolutions came and fundamentally changed that sort of power structure. So to the point where, the free market, capitalist big corporation is hugely powerful, government's a lot more powerful, and community is down here. It's the sort of the power has been stripped away. And what he argues is that really to address that problem, all we can really do is to find ways to sort of give community more power, because we're not going to take away the power from existing systems too easily. So this centralization of power in public and private systems within a hyper-capitalist system, creates some fundamental problems from our perspective. One, it creates a very strong force towards sort of individual wealth creation, individualism, often at the expense of others in our community and obviously the environment. I guess the second fundamental problem is that we in New Zealand, just like every other country, have a proportion of our society where, for whatever reason, they haven't done well out of the capitalist system. So the vulnerable, disadvantaged, the plain unlucky. And in New Zealand, obviously the effects of colonisation has had a disproportionate effect on the indigenous Maori culture. So, and we know, that the figures are telling us the gap between the haves and the have-nots is increasing. So we as a society have put in place this complex, we would argue, complex, fragmented, bureaucratic system of welfare support, philanthropy, charity to support this part of society. But this system is fundamentally based on this power imbalance. Generally it's the very well-meaning and hard-working, but generally the sort of privileged, powerful people in the public sector, in the philanthropic space, making decisions that affect vulnerable and disadvantaged. So this done-to model is ultimately disempowering to individuals and community, and people have lost their purpose, their autonomy in those groups. So I guess the solution that we're sort of focused on is this. The underpinning philosophy is behind the Wellbeing Protocol is that it's good to give more power to communities. That has positive outcomes at so many levels. There's a lovely quote from a lady called Ellen Ostrom, who some of you may have come across, the first woman to win the Nobel Prize for economics. She said, "There's no reason to believe that the bureaucrats and politicians, no matter how well-meaning, are better at solving the problems than the people on the spot who have the strongest incentive to get the solution right." So it's this kind of idea of localism and the benefits of localism. So how do you give communities more power? The power to identify local issues, make decisions on how to prioritize, allocate resources, all of that stuff. So this is the stuff that our government does at a national level, but isn't very good at doing at a local level. And this is where we can really start to stand on the shoulders of some of the amazing pioneers in this space. People who've been working on things like complementary currencies, time banks, local exchange trading systems, Ellen Ostrom's work on managing the commons, the work out of the permaculture world around 8 alternative forms of capital, that sort of thing. DISCO, which stands for Distributed Cooperative Organizations, out of Spain. They've done some really interesting work around that. But also in New Zealand, our indigenous culture, they have tremendous wisdom that has been lost, in the West around sort of collective ownership and governance and the power of community. So we really want to sort of tap into that knowledge. But underpinning all that is this new technology infrastructure, the blockchain and Web3, which gives us this new sort of tool and design patterns that we believe give us, for the first time in human history, it allows us to build localized but scalable common good infrastructure that is outside of the control of state and corporation. So it's open source itself, it's community driven, built infrastructure. So kind of open source, but with a sort of economic model wrapped around it. So we believe that we can build local economic systems that support individual, community, and environmental well-being, and that's really the journey we're on. And I guess the first step for us it has been this plan to create a small community, or to work with the community to co-create a community development DAO. So it's essentially an entity that is genuinely owned and controlled by the community. It is serving an entity whose purpose is to support individual, community, and environmental well-being. And especially our indigenous cultures, they know how intrinsically connected these three things are: individual, community, and environment. So an entity that can hold assets, can make decisions, can drive incentives to create incentives for positive outcomes, and really and we believe that blockchain and digital tokens and tokenomic design patterns are part of the solution. And I would stress it's just part. It's not, there's a whole lot of other stuff that's nothing to do with technology around the sort of relationship building and governance design and learning and support, and which has nothing to do with technology. But we believe if we can do it for one community, then it can be reproduced for the next community and sort of grow organically. So
fantastic. And so, I mean, how is it going, and what have you learned so far?
Yeah, so it's been a journey. Sort of started almost a couple of years ago for me. A few of us got accepted into the GovTech Accelerator program in Wellington. Went through that 3-month program. We pitched at Parliament. Kind of naively thought that because it was such a cool idea that we'd have people queuing up to sort of support us and fund us. But yeah, that didn't eventuate. But out of that, what we did do is form relationships with 2 key organizations who were doing awesome work out in this community of Cannons Creek, which is a kind of a low socioeconomic community just half an hour north of Wellington. So there was Wesley Community Action, so they're a charity, and they also ran a fruit and veg co-op, and also Ngāti Toa, so the local tribe out there. And it became very clear that we needed those relationships to build trust with the community, because it was one of the key learnings is that it's quite understandably the community was pretty skeptical about a couple of white privileged guys, one with an English accent, sort of turning up and talking about something that looks a bit like Bitcoin. But Wesley and Ngāti Toa really helped us sort of to connect with that community. And they also gave us some initial funding, but not much. It was enough to sort of get started. But we kind of made the decision early on. Let's just, we didn't have enough money, but but we had a sort of a growing number of volunteers who were happy to sort of put in some time. So we just thought we're just going to start. Let's try and build something and just see where it goes, so we can help us to understand what we don't know, help us to understand how the community would respond to this concept, the technology limitations, the communication challenges, all of that. So we thought, let's just start trying stuff. And yeah, so with limited resources, we sort of framed up a trial, and essentially it was we built a digital wallet, so within an app on iOS and Android, Apple and Android. And this app was super easy to use and gave the user the ability to hold and transfer the Canon coin, so named after the region we're in. So you hold up your camera and your QR code, and I can easily transmit my Canon coin. So it was a blockchain-based digital token. And we found 50 people in the community to help us with this trial, and we gave them 50 Canon coins each. And we said each Canon coin is worth $1 New Zealand. So this is essentially what we were built as a reserve-backed token. So we minted 50 tokens to 50 people, so 2,500 tokens we minted, and we kept 2,500 real dollars in the Wesley bank account to back that up, so that if there was a run on the bank, we could support that. So that's what's known as a reserve-backed currency. And we said to people, you can use your Canon in 4 different ways. You can just transact amongst yourselves, pay for some babysitting, whatever. You can buy from the $12 fruit and veg basket, or 12 Canon coins every week. You can use it to buy your fruit and veg, and we integrated that purchasing thing into the app. Or you can donate some or all of your Canon coins towards a community fund, which was again on the app. You can see who's donating. Or you could, at the end, you could swap your Canon coins for real money. So you could come to us at the end and get real money. But we said there's a heavy tax on that, it's a 50% tax. So if you come to us with 50 cans, we'll give you $25 at the end. So this really gave us an opportunity to engage with the community, to get feedback, to understand some of the technology challenges, and just really start to test some of the concepts of using a sort of a local digital token in a sort of in a socioeconomic community. What we also did, important bit I missed, is on the app, we created a way for people to propose community initiatives that would be good for the community. So they could just literally click on a button and say, I think this thing would be good. And it went into a list, and then we used a thing called quadratic voting to experiment with. Anybody else in the community could then sort of vote, essentially upvote or downvote some of those ideas. So the idea was the good ones would rise to the top, And then the idea, which we didn't really sort of see working because the trial wasn't long enough, but the idea and principle was that then the community could come together, or a sort of an elected sort of subset of the community would decide to give some of the community fund to the projects that the community wanted, and those that would create an incentive for those projects to actually get off the ground. And so we create this sort of circular thing. So yeah, so that's kind of where we got to. And then, yeah, so since then we've sort of written the trial was limited, we just ran it for 2 months. We had conversations with the Reserve Bank and the Financial Markets Authority here, and because what it did do is get a lot of publicity, which surprised us. We got on the TV, on the 6 o'clock news, on the national news, and a lot of radio coverage, and so it brought a lot of publicity. And then the government started saying, "Oh, hang on, what are you doing? Creating your own money?" And that's what we got into those conversations, which was a useful sort of dialogue. So since then we've written a white paper, and we're sort of planning that the next phase and focusing on sort of raising money to fund the next phase.
Well, actually, that's a good segue, because it was on my list, but has also come up in the chat, is funding.
Yeah.
And how are you funded so far? And I guess, what are some of the options in terms of funding? We saw a lot of, initial coin offerings a couple of years ago. That seems to have died down a little bit. I'm not sure, but what are some of the ways in which, well, what are you doing? And then what are some of the ways in which people can fund these sorts of initiatives?
Yeah, so getting funding, this is part of my sort of naivety and lack of experience in sort of raising money. That's not what I've been doing my career. But yeah, there was this almost parallel story around sort of getting money for this, because to us it was a no-brainer. This had so much potential. Of course we could get funding, but of course one of the challenges was explaining the concept, and convincing people that it was such a good idea. But it really highlighted, I guess, an interesting bigger problem around getting government or other funding to support community-driven projects. Whether it's our project or any community-driven projects. We spoke to a lot of people out in the community, charities, and just sort of people who are doing awesome stuff. But they said they're spending most of their time trying to apply for grants through many different channels, and it was employing people, and it was taking up half their time, and that was and especially for sort of disruptive higher risk technology projects, it became apparent that it's very hard to raise money from the sort of traditional system, so yes, so we've been looking at that problem almost as a separate work stream. How do we, and we've got a big grant application with a sort of a Foundation for New Economy, I think they're called, in the UK. They're super interested in what we've done, so we've been shortlisted for that. But yeah, so there are sort of these niche sort of funds that may support us. We're also, there's this emerging world of impact DAOs. So these are using DAO technology, which essentially can be thought of as a treasury with voting rights. And so there's a bunch. I'm involved in a few impact DAO projects where groups of people around the world are pooling their money and deciding to sort of fund social good projects. So that's an interesting. And so we're sort of looking at potentially getting funding from some of those. But essentially, to answer your problem, we need more funding for the next phase. We've got an awesome group of people, steering group and a core team, mostly volunteering time, and we've sort of agreed, this is what we need for the next phase to sort of do it properly. But our main focus is raising that money so we can move ahead.
Cool. We're getting, this time is flying by. This is super interesting stuff, and I have lots of questions, but I know other people do as well. And so I want to give these last 15 minutes to dip into the chat and give people the opportunity to kind of pull on whatever thread is most interesting to you, because I think there's a lot of pullable threads that have come up. But perhaps while you're all thinking about that, just wanted to bring you in, potentially, Alex, if there's anything, perspective that you'd like to add. You guys have been from a more, I guess, research and systems point of view, though you're obviously very systems focused as well, Mark, but also in the trenches of obviously running your own trials, initiatives, fundraising, and so on. What's really exciting you about this space at the moment, Alex, and what do you think is exciting about the Wellbeing Protocol specifically?
So I guess, and Mark made this point, which I think is really key, that the technology is only a tool. And I think it's best to see it as infrastructure for basically systems and network cooperation. You know, it enables things that previously we've kind of needed kind of superstructures to do, like central banks or kind of, you know, local central government systems, and enables this whole idea of, you know, secure, permissionless and programmable for us to create our own micro infrastructures, which enable us to organize, act and cooperate and exchange value in different ways. So we obviously sort of, I think in the impact space, we're increasingly realizing that complex systems problems require dynamic systemic responses. And these tools are enabling of some of those responses. So if you think sort of really kind of, you know, sort of practically, and I know there's sort of Kira from the B Corp network and Jess from Social Enterprise Australia. If you're trying to develop a means for a bunch of autonomous actors to find ways to coordinate and cooperate with each other, you know, sort of these technologies can be really enabling to sort of basically give everyone a way to sort of vote and have a voice on something. And then on top of that kind of way to kind of have your voice, you can actually start to build in sort of value exchange as well. And then you get to the point where you can also use some of these things to hold and transact information. So you're seeing some really interesting applications where NFTs, unique digital assets, are being layered onto geography, you know, and effectively restoration, the purchase of that NFT is securing the restoration of that land. But then as that land starts to regenerate and increase biodiversity, capture carbon, satellite technology can pick up the change in the environment and then process that back onto a token, which can realize a sort of an economic value as well. So this incredible sort of layering of value, governance, and information suddenly gives you a huge amount of, you know, kind of sort of an experimental space. And on that, it's worth noting here as well that people, you know, and I've heard, you know, sort of a few versions of this, but sort of kind of say in Web3, it's the equivalent of the year 2000 in Web2. So Google has started, but Facebook hasn't shown up yet. You know, so if you think back to like how you saw some of those things at that time, that's the kind of headspace we're in, trying to figure out where's this going to go and what's the potential application. And coming back to your second question about the Wellbeing Protocol, I think the really important thing about what Mark's doing and things like the Wellbeing, they are experiments. They're ways of starting to test and play with how this technology can have a real practical use and a use for public good rather than private gain, which is a lot of that stuff catches the narrative around crypto, right? You know, basically hype cycles, tech bros, you know, Ponzi schemes. And so we need more wellbeing protocols to actually test how this can be used for civic and public infrastructure rather than just kind of, you know, sort of cowboys.
That's really interesting. That's a great contribution, Alex. Thank you. And I think that analogy to 2000 is really interesting and just got me thinking about, I think that's a really interesting point and probably true around, you know, just to help people grasp the opportunity and how much change is just about to come, if that's a similar stage. But I don't know if it's just that I'm so much older now than I was in 2000, but in some ways that opportunity feels less intuitive than, you know, like if you were paying attention in 2000 and you were kind of already online, it felt very intuitive that all these other things were going to go online. You know, that didn't seem like, you know, I'm not a technologist per se. I've been in and around technology, but I'm, you know, not a developer or a computer scientist or anything. But without needing to really understand the technology, I felt like in 2000, I broadly understood the opportunity, how online interaction with, you know, and I was running experiments as a non-hardcore technologist in, you know, ran an early version of a virtual summit in 2000 and things like that to try and experiment. How could we have conversation and be involved in politics and make things happen online? And I feel like it's exciting to think that that's the same point we're at, but I find it just so much harder. It feels like without that deep understanding of the technology, how the actual wiring is working, it's so much harder to then grasp that next opportunity. And I'm wondering how we can kind of make the technology piece, I guess, less of a barrier to facilitate people's imagination and, you know, to help them see that trajectory without needing to be the expert on the technology. Does that question make sense? I'm trying to kind of put into words something that I was feeling as you shared that analogy.
No, I think it does. I mean, I think we need more practical use cases where people can see, oh, that would be valuable to me. So I think some of this, you know, take, I mean, all the concern around surveillance and, you know, sort of basically, you know, people using our data for their, you know, broader gains. One of the things that will happen, I imagine, sort of through the proliferation of wallets is we start to take our identity and data around with us. So when we plug into a social networking platform, we plug in as ourselves rather than, you know, kind of basically sign up to that platform, which means we're not hostage. We can take all our information, we can go and plug it in elsewhere as well. Now, expand that to something like, in my wallet, I'm also a member of Social Enterprise Australia. And there are Shopify APIs now where you plug in your wallet. And so you allow who you're engaging with in a commercial transaction to see who you are. Now, maybe I go to a B Corp, which kind of likes the fact that I'm a member of Social Enterprise Australia, and it sort of changes my shopping experience through price or the range of profits or, you know, sort of products and, you know, other points of engagement. So I think one of the things is we have to see, it's like, it's not just individual things, it's also then how these things start to connect up. Another really quick example. So a colleague in Canada was speaking around how they're developing really good virtual energy profiling of different sort of properties and buildings. And so what they're looking to do is, how do you put that, rather than keep that energy profile or, you know, sort of the energy performance profile of a property on a kind of someone's database, you put it on an NFT, which is kind of linked to that property. So if you're a homeowner, just as you've got your deeds of ownership, you've also got an NFT, which has got your energy profile. Then guess what? If you go to the bank, they might change your rate of mortgage or capital depending on the ledger, how much work you've done to actually improve the energy performance of your house. And when you move house, the NFT stays with that property. So a lot of the value in this is not just going to be the single use case. It's going to be how these interconnected ways of transaction and cooperating and signaling our identity and our contribution start to stack up. And that's the really exciting bit, which is hard to anticipate, but comes back to the point why we need more experiments.
And just one quick caveat that, you know, we have got this challenge around sort of proof of identity, proof of humanity, which is being worked on by a bunch of projects, but we're still not there yet. So yeah, so that once that's solved, that will sort of open up many more opportunities and make opportunities viable.
It's a great point about, you know, being able to share more practical examples of these things in progress. Wellbeing protocols are a really good one, and I love the kind of scale of that. That's a kind of, you know, something we can wrap our head around, I think, as a local community experiment. And then, as you said, how that begins to interconnect with everything else. There was a question in the chat that speaks to that around, well, what are some details of some of the impact DAOs in action? Love to explore this further. Maybe that's just a chance to pick out another interesting example and share with us in the interest of sharing more of those kind of practical use case experiments. Would either of you like to share a different DAO example, maybe your VC DAO I was interested in, Mark, that we mentioned at the very beginning, and kind of how that actually operates to distribute those $50 million in a more community-focused, less hyper-capitalist kind of a way?
Well, yes, so Metacartel was, we set up 2.5 years ago. There were 20 of us originally, and it was one of the first experiments in a venture capital DAO. It wasn't specifically an impact DAO. It wasn't to make the planet better. It was to support Web3 sort of projects, because we felt that was the future. So that grew from 20 people to 70 people all around the world. There's 2 people in New Zealand and I think a couple in Australia. And yeah, we have a fund that was, you know, goes up and down with the price of crypto, but it's, you know, it's whatever, it's 10, 20 million, no, about 25 million currently US, but in crypto assets, no bank accounts. And we have invested in 40 sort of Web3 companies. So we give them some ETH, they give us some of their tokens, and we hope that their token is going to be successful and go up, and we make money. So it's actually just a capitalist. It's very modeled on the sort of traditional VC model. So but what's interesting is, you know, we've experimented with sort of things like rage quit. So rage quit is an interesting pattern where if we vote on all decisions on chain, so we put a chain on the blockchain, a vote on a proposal to invest in a company. If I disagree with that vote, but most people say yes, then I've got a 48-hour grace period, and I can rage quit within that period. So I can press a button. I don't need to ask anybody. I can pull out my shares, all my assets out of the fund, you know, instantly. And again, it's just an elegant way to sort of de-risk that whole system. That's one sort of innovation that came through from there. But yeah, having been through that experience with Metacartel, that's what sort of really excited me about the sort of impact DAO space, because, you know, you could apply some of the learnings of that experience to actually a group of people who really cared about making, you know, positive social change. And I'm involved in one in London and India at the moment. We're trying to set one up, and I know there's a bunch of others being sort of thought about. So yeah.
Cool. I was going to say, Liz, you patiently had your hand up, but it doesn't really work like that in Zoom. You just clicked a button. But let's bring it. I'll unmute you, and let's bring in your. I have to ask you to unmute. Hang on, Liz, you're still muted.
I was being very patient. Thanks very much, Tom. So, Matt, I'm just really grateful for the presentation. As Alex and Tom knows, I'm playing around with how we can do experiments around so much of my work as CEO of the Menzies Foundation, and looking at supporting a leadership movement for the greater good touches deliberative democracy in all sorts of ways. And I'm interested in the nexus between communities having agency to decide the futures they want and what the funding mechanism is that might support that. So I'd love to find a way to engage with you, but I can't fund you in New Zealand, if that makes sense. Are you, in terms of the experiments, are you thinking about how there might be opportunities for us to tap into the sort of thinking and expertise that you're doing in the project that you're working on, but in some ways leverage that into some of the conversations we're having in Australia?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, you know, the Wellbeing Protocol doesn't actually exist as a legal entity currently. You know, we don't have a bank account. You know, the fact that I'm based in New Zealand and, you know, some of my colleagues are, I think, you know, we've got global ambitions, and we want this project to succeed. So, you know, if there was funding for a trial in Australia or wherever else, yeah, absolutely, we could work with you to make that happen. So yeah, we just, you know, the key thing is, you know, it's open source. Everybody benefits from, you know, multiple experiments happening. And yeah, we just want to sort of share our learning and collaborate, not compete with anybody else in the space, and just grow the sort of community of learning around the sort of social good meets Web3 space.
Because Tom, contrary to, I think, your suggestion about having to know it, I think what the amazing opportunity is in this space is bringing together multiple expertises to define or discover what the potential of this is. Do you know what I mean? Like, so Mark, you know, the project that I've got in mind is a community resilience citizen leadership project based on climate justice. That's very hard to get a handle on systemically because it's such a complex organism to pull together. And listening to you, I wonder if the DAO becomes the catalyzer, because it provides the fulcrum in which these sorts of consideration can be given to the agenda and who's involved and how that plays out in terms of what decisions are made. So I'd love to have a chance to have a chat with you about how, as I said, the DAO becomes the generator of the, you know what I mean, versus setting something up and applying a DAO, how the DAO might be the engine to build out insight and understanding about what community priorities are and how to fund them. So as I said, I really welcome that opportunity. Alex, you and I have talked about that too. I think that, you know, is a very interesting way of thinking about how you think about creating systems change, but rather than applying a tool, using it as the tool, I suppose.
Yeah, that's super interesting, Liz. And yeah, you're exactly right about bringing people together. We're all of us are smarter than any of us, and particularly when we're in such a rapidly evolving area. No one has all the answers or certainly all the ideas. Yeah, it occurs to me that it's also another way to think about a common topic in the social enterprise space of how best we ensure mission lock with some of our different organizations, entities, and so on. And a DAO, you know, with clear protocols and priorities and, you know, agreed up front, is another way of thinking about potentially ensuring that mission lock around some of the activities. I want to just bring one last question at the risk of, I know we're really tight for time, but it's a really interesting one from Michael Leung from Digital Storytellers and Social Enterprise National Strategy and SECNA and Social Enterprise Forum and all the things Mike is involved with. But he runs a content creation social enterprise. So maybe I'll just read your question quickly, Mikey, if you don't mind, in the interest of time. Just, do you know of any Creative Commons-like DAOs? He has wondered about how impact-focused creative content could be attached to a value exchange system with stakeholders. Just want to get some rapid fire. Are you aware of any? Are there any places that you could suggest for Mikey to do further research on that topic?
Alex, do you come across any?
Well, I mean, I'd say sort of more broadly, you know, a lot of the ways that NFTs originally got sort of traction was around kind of creative production, particularly sort of artworks. And the idea that once a creator has put something out there, any number of people may use it, but when that's used, there's a way to actually make sure some value goes back to the original creator. You know, again, it's that programmability of things like, you know, sort of, you know, the NFTs, which can then hold effectively anything. So I think, you know, sort of these infrastructures can be incredibly enabling for Creative Commons and creative communities.
Yeah, because I guess the whole idea of Creative Commons was kind of slightly more, you know, was more blended sets of IP options rather than just the all or nothing, all rights reserved, no rights reserved, but to create that gradients of fine for community projects, pay me if it's commercial, and you could just embed all of those into the asset, those different criteria. So yeah, that is a really interesting use case. We are out of time, and so thank you everyone for joining us today. This has been super interesting. Mark, I know a lot of people are going to want to keep up with your work and engage with you further, as we've heard in the chat and the questions. What's the best place for people just to kind of, you know, follow along with you on these experiments and to learn with you as you're figuring things out? Yeah,
I'm not a big on the whole social media stuff. LinkedIn is probably where I do most of my posting. With the Wellbeing Protocol.org website, again, once we get a bit more funding, we'll invest in, we'll put a lot more effort into sort of community building, and you can sign up for a newsletter there, so we will fire out information via email when we can. So probably LinkedIn and email mark@thewellbeingprotocol.org if you want to contact me directly.
Brilliant. Thank you all for your time today. This has been part of our Start Some Good Network series of events. Thank you to all the members who've turned up. If you're not currently a member of the network, it's $15 a month to join, and you get invited to 3 or 4 sessions like this and some other formats each month, as well as being invited to an online community and us working hard to provide other sorts of opportunities and information you need to do more good. So we'll send out a link to that afterwards, and perhaps about whatever next event we have coming up. And thank you all for your time today, and thank you so much, Mark and Alex, for having this conversation with me. I've learned a lot. It's been really inspiring.